Hi, I'm supposed to be working on a much bigger video right now, but the motivation for it is just not there for me. So I'm gonna resort to what every YouTuber hack fraud falls back on when they want to get a video out but have no inspiration. Cheap, easy to produce content, like top 10 lists. And I figure, why not do a quick one of these for some of my favorite episodes from one of my favorite shows of all time. Hey, it's also surprisingly fitting for the season, even though this was never planned to be a Halloween video. And real fast, I'm not gonna go very in-depth with most of these choices because I'm just trying to get this video out relatively quickly, sorry. I don't even plan on doing plot summaries. Genuinely, I expect you to have some kind of knowledge of this show and its episodes before watching this, and if you don't, that's on you. And with the opening out of the way, let's get into my top 10 favorite episodes from Jonan Vasquez's Invader Zim. Starting off with not even an episode sure is a choice I made, and I am 100% certain that I have got controversial opinions on this one. Enter the Florpus is really good, and I wish I could call it more than really good, but man... Alright, let's just get into it. My two biggest gripes with Enter the Florpus are how certain characters are characterized and the art direction. I'll get that second one out of the way real quick because I have less to say about it and I'm sure it's the claim more people are going to be upset by. So let me preface this by saying this art direction is fantastic. Jenny Goldberg did an amazing job as art director for this. She took the original show style and updated it for a more modern audience, and to say it looks anything other than gorgeous is just a straight up lie. That said, I don't like this style for Zim. It looks too soft, too rounded, and weirdly too clean, even though it's still trying to capture the original show's dirtiness in places. But it's still quite a treat for the eyes regardless. Now, onto my bigger gripe, the characters. For the most part, they're fine. They're still enjoyable, but I hate to say they're a bit flanderized, in my opinion. In some instances, I'd even go as far to say that they're not even the same characters anymore. And it's not like these characters had a whole lot of depth in the first place, although sites like Tumblr might try to make you think otherwise, but they definitely weren't just...
all over the place. Look at me steering with my widow steering hands.
Dib and Gaz, who are most of the focus for the movie, make it out okay, although Gaz is a little too nice in my opinion, but whatever. But characters like Zim, Professor Membrane, and especially the tallest are all a bit worse for wear. To be fair, Zim is almost the same, but I feel his most notable attributes have definitely been pushed a bit further than they used to be, like his yelling, for instance. His dynamic with Dib has also shifted to a more traditional villain versus hero kind of thing, and I don't love that either. Professor Membrane might as well be an entirely new character because he's just a good dad now, and if you watch the original show, he was definitely not that. And the tallest, my favorite characters from the original series, God do they get it the worst in this movie. They're both just complete morons now, and they have absolutely no sense of self-preservation. They also might as well just both be the same character, because there's fundamentally no difference between them in Florpus besides their color schemes and voices. And a little side tangent about the voices for a sec, man do the tallest, and Zim to an extent, not sound right. It's not super surprising, all these guys are older now, and there's nothing wrong with that. I wouldn't want anyone else to play these characters, but they definitely don't sound the same anymore. Red, especially my favorite of my favorites, doesn't even sound close to me.
Oh, wait! Zim! We hate him! You're trained as an Invader Zim. Battle tanks are for hardened soldiers.
And again, I want to make it clear that that's not a problem, it's just something I can't help but notice every time I rewatch the movie. Getting back to my original point, I don't love the direction Florpus took with some of these characters, especially my two favorites, but that's just how it ended up being. And in the instance of the tallest, they're not in it very much, so it's not that big of a deal, but there are these little things with them that I just wish were done differently. Oh, and Gur is completely unchanged from the show, which to be fair, there was nothing to flanderize there in the first place. And in spite of my issues with the movie, it's still an incredibly fun watch, with the highest animation quality the series has ever seen. Most of the time. It was also just really exciting to see all these characters again when the movie first came out, perfectly written or not. And overall, it's still an experience well worth your time, whether you're new to the series or if you're a longtime fan like me. Although, come to think of it, you might actually get more out of this if you haven't seen the show. Whatever. Peace is Nice will be stuck in my head for the rest of eternity, I swear. This is probably the funniest episode in the series to me, and that's a really high bar because this show is fucking hilarious most of the time. But man, this one takes the cake, especially whenever these two dumbass aliens are on screen. Their experiments are absolutely nonsensical. Their designs don't match their voices or personalities at all, so you've got this fun dissonance with that aspect. They know even less about Earth than Zim does, which is a feat in itself, and they can't tell the difference between a gopher and a human being. And I love how incompetent they are. For instance, when Zim and Gur get to the escape pod at the end of the episode, the most they do is, well, showing you does it better justice, I think. Oh, and Zim himself is also exceptionally funny in this episode. It's really neat to see him take on what is usually Dib's role as the voice of reason, and every time he points out how bad these aliens are or what they do, it makes me at the very least have this big dumb smile on my face. Seriously, every time he hears these two say something dumb, he just has to chime in and it's always paced super well.
But enough philosophy.
But we haven't been talking about...
Let the hideous experiments begin.
This episode has some really amazing background design too, although that's not exactly special for this series. But I still feel the need to point it out because the show had some crazy good backgrounds and also especially animation for the time, and I'd say they both still hold up even now. I plan to get a little more into those topics when we get to some of the bigger episodes on this list though. Also, I'm kinda out of things to say for this one. Like, besides it being really funny, it's probably the most basic out of all these episodes on this list. Of course, that's not a bad thing at all. It wouldn't be on this list if I thought it was, but unfortunately things that are usually just funny don't leave a lot to talk about, so, you know. This episode kind of doesn't even really count, since it's not part of the original show's run and the only official way to watch it is through the bonus features on some of the series' physical releases. I'm gonna talk about it anyway because I find it a strange anomaly in the series' history. I also love it to bits, in part due to its status as that aforementioned anomaly. In comparison to the final show, it both looks really weird and sounds really weird. You could tell certain things weren't fully fleshed out yet either, like some designs are pretty close to their final looks, but others are just fucking strange. And Zim's voice. If there's one thing that's most noticeable about this pilot, it is the distinct lack of Richard Stephen Horvitz as Zim. Funny story that, if you're a fan of the show, you probably have heard this a million times before, but Joan and Vasquez originally wanted Richard for Zim pretty early on, but due to the fact that he was still playing Daggett in Angry Beavers, they had to find someone else. That someone else being Billy West, a voice actor you've definitely heard before, especially if your tastes are like mine, and more specifically if you're a fan of Futurama. I honestly really like Billy's take on Zim, and the more I've gone back to the pilot over the years, the more it's grown on me. Richard was definitely the way to go, and I can't hear anyone else as Zim, but I still really like Billy's portrayal too. His performance is borderline unhinged, which is really fitting with the pilot because I think no better word fits it.
I have a stomach!
There's something about this episode that makes it feel a bit more deranged, for lack of a better word. I don't know if it's because the art direction is lower fi than the series, or maybe it's how the characters sound even more insane than the show somehow a lot of the time.
What's the matter? Scared of beans? Space boy?
There's just something off about the vibe of this that I really, really love. Fun fact about the voice actors again, did you know there's a version of the pilot with Mark Hamill as Zim? There's no publicly available full version, sadly, it's just some of his audio, but from the little of that take you can find online, I completely understand why Mark wasn't kept as Zim. Hamill's a great actor, don't get me wrong, and he's proven himself to be quite adept at playing debased lunatics before, but his voice is too deep for me and his pronunciation of some of Zim's weirder lines in this are a little too forced sounding in my opinion. There's also a version of the pilot floating around somewhere that has Richard as Zim, but unlike Hamill's take, you can actually find this version on the internet fairly easily. I'm not going to tell you how, for obvious reasons. I'm already probably going to get fucked over by Nickelodeon anyway, just for using footage of the show. I gotta say, it's really weird watching that version, being so used to Billy's voice in the pilot. I'm also pretty sure not all of the lines are replaced by Richard, because a lot of the time they're identical to the original version of the pilot. Richard also just sounds a little off in it to me, but I don't know if that's because, like I said, I'm way more used to Billy, or if there was maybe some problem with Richard matching the timing for the pilot, since it wasn't animated with his performance in mind initially.
It's time to show the human boy the meaning of superior being.
It's time to show the human boy the meaning of superior being.
I'm sorry I'm invested in inconsequential voice actor trivia, it's just something I find very interesting. I'm also not actually sorry, fuck you. Anyway, time to move on to the next episode, and fittingly, whereas the pilot, and many pilots like it, was designed to show off a slice of what the show would normally be like for network executives, The Nightmare Begins gets to be the actual start of the show, setting up the main cast and the world around them. There's a lot of fun world building in this episode, despite how early on in the show's history it is. There was clearly a good chunk of the background universe, or at least the Irken and Earth societies, thought out before we got to this point. And that's really funny in comparison to the pilot, which was very clearly during a time where the show, and by extension its world, wasn't yet all that developed. I've always loved how Irken technology looks and works. It's something I always wished to see more details about as a kid, and if the show hadn't gotten cancelled, I likely would've. Going back to what I said about the characters, it's impressive how well this episode does introducing them and making them fun to watch all in just about 30 minutes. Seriously, we meet every major cast member in this episode, and yet it somehow doesn't feel bloated in the slightest. The most important thing to come out of this episode is Zim and Dib's rivalry, and they knocked it out of the park from the very beginning. I've always loved these guys' dynamic, because while Dib is right about Zim being both an alien and evil, despite what Florpus might make you believe if it's the only Zim-related thing you've seen, Dib is in this battle with Zim almost almost entirely for self-benefit. The best example of this is in Dib's Wonderful Life of Doom, I think. Saving the Earth is just a bonus, when it even is in danger, which is almost never from Zim because he's wildly incompetent as an invader. Dib drew a classmate, alien or not, getting dissected for Christ's sake. He's arguably just as fucked up as Zim. It's a big part of what makes the show so fun to watch in my opinion. Both of our leads aren't really good guys in any sense of the term. They're both delusional, selfish weirdos who are almost entirely only looking out for themselves, and that will always be more exciting and interesting to me than a predefined good guy archetype going against a predefined bad guy archetype. Look, I know I'm harping on Florpus a bit too much, but I just can't help it when it's this easy. It made when they team up in episodes a lot of fun too, because unlike other shows that would have the villain and hero working together and finding some sort of mutual respect for each other, Dib and Zim hate each other to the bitter fucking end. They're complete assholes to one another almost all of the time, no matter the circumstance, and for some reason a lot of fans of the show seem to have missed that part of their dynamic. Moving on from that, I want to get into how good of a first impression this episode is visually too. The show starts with a bang with these huge set pieces and planets and CG ships, and it's all aged really well. The CG especially is so well integrated with the 2D animation that the crew for Futurama applauded the show and its crew for it. You can definitely tell it's old CG now, but I think it still looks really fitting whenever it's used. For the most part. Hell, even when it's not, which is rare, it's still charming in a way. And don't get me started on this show's character design. As an artist myself, and my favorite thing to draw being character designs, it's probably no surprise that Zim, and by extension Jonah Vasquez's other work, were huge influences on me stylistically. Somehow, this show manages to have surprisingly simple designs, while they all manage to still look distinct from one another, especially members of the same species, like Urkins. Sorry to dump all this stuff on you now, by the way, it just seemed the most applicable place to do so. And again, I'm not actually sorry, fuck you. But yeah, the Nightmare Begins as a fantastic beginning to a show that would do nothing but get better and better from this point on. And now, it's time to talk about every goth person's second favorite character from this show. This is one of the only episodes focused on Gaz, and man will this and Gaz's other most major episodes and appearances really make you wish the show gave her more of the spotlight from time to time. She's such a fun character since she's just as aware of the fact that Zim is an alien trying to take over the world as Dib, but unlike her brother, she just doesn't give a fuck about any of it. She doesn't care about saving the world. In fact, she is one of the only main cast members to even acknowledge that Zim is wildly bad at being an invader, and that he probably wouldn't be able to take over with or without Dib going against him. The only things Gaz really care about is her dad, her pizza, and her video games. She's also probably got some kind of mind powers, but don't worry about it. This episode is really enjoyable because we get to see Gaz pretty much just go full horror movie monster on this one kid that stole the last copy of a game console she was waiting for right from under her. And the kid she's tormenting this whole episode, Iggins, is hilarious. She also basically kills the guy at the end of the episode, which leads into one of the funniest final shots in the entire series. It's not Gaz's biggest episode, but it has such a simple premise that's executed so well that it manages to stand above her other focus episodes for me. As a quick aside, according to Jonan, Gaz was never intended to be goth, but I mean, intended or not, man, how did you not realize Gaz looked goth as fuck? Her design in Florpus is probably more fitting for her character, even though I prefer her original design purely out of nostalgia, but again, like, how? Just how? I always loved the beginning of this episode since it showed us all the other real invaders invading their planets, even if pretty early on it's revealed none of this shit is really happening, maybe? It let us see a bit more of the universe, even if it wasn't much, and as a kid I loved that world building shit, man. This is also one of the only times Zim saves the day on purpose, without any help or coercing from Dib. I mean, he does it just so that he can go back and take it over for himself, but hey, a good deed is still a good deed, right? And the threat of this episode is such a strange sci-fi concept that was totally new to me as a kid. And the way it's executed is so fun too, with the Earth being stolen by these two trucker alien guys so they can dump it in their dying sun. I love Zim's confrontations with these guys too. They don't have the biggest impact on the series, but I always look forward to seeing them again on rewatches, whether that being when we first see them or when Zim fights the bigger guy. Side note, Zim's armor in this episode, as useless as it is for him, I always thought looked dope as shit. It's really funny too that he puts on this tough guy act before starting his fight with the big alien just for it to cut away and then back to him being pulped. This is also one of the first bigger scaled episodes that takes us off of Earth, kind of. It's because of its larger scale that I actually almost always forget that this isn't one of the 30-minute specials, it's just the standard 11 minutes. I always really liked that scale as a kid, and still as an adult. Although, other episodes would use their scale better than this one, as you'll see from the later entries coming up. Speaking of which... Okay, being real, this is actually on a smaller scale than the last entry. That transition was just really clean and I wanted to keep it. This episode finally gives me more of a chance to talk about every goth person's favorite character from this show, Gur. And let me tell ya, I hate what a lot of the fanbase and Nickelodeon and merch creators did to this little guy, because they misunderstood the very simple rule with him. Gur works because he's not used that often. You really have to know when to add Gur in a story to make him funny, because overusing him makes him more obnoxious than entertaining. Personally, I have no problems with how the show, the comic, or Florpus used the character. I do have a bit of a problem with how the fanbase and the general public ran him into the ground, though. It's the exact same thing that happened with Space Corps when Portal 2 came out. And look, I'm not knocking anyone that uses Gur in a way I don't like. In fact, I implore you to be even more annoying with the character, actually, because there's nothing better in this world than annoying some petty asshole, me, who disagrees with you on something like this that doesn't matter. And of course, none of that ruins the character for me anyway. I still love Gur, and I think he's very well used by the crew who made the show and other official media for the franchise. There's just this unfortunately hipster part of me that wishes he wasn't all the show was known for to the general public because of how misused I think he's been. None of this matters to the episode, also. Gur is nothing like the version of himself that made him popular in the first place for most of this one anyway. That's part of why it's such an interesting episode to me and so high up on my list. Gur takes on an archetype I really like in this episode, which is a robot or AI that's evil not because they're actually evil, but because they're following orders so intently that they become a danger to everyone around them. Not to mention, this take on Gur is actually kind of unsettling, and I love it. This is also Ricky Simon's best performance as Gur in the series, in my opinion. For a guy that was picked to play Gur specifically because he sounded amateurish, he really kills it as evil Gur in this episode. Also, there's a guy with a squid's brain that shits himself in this one. Make of that what you will. You know, I guess it's actually a good opportunity to talk about this show's weirder aspects. You probably already know this, especially by now, but Invader Zim is a weird show that always felt out of place next to its contemporaries in a really cool way. And it's always been one of the darkest cartoons you could watch on a network like this. I mean, compared to one of, say, Jimmy Neutron's scariest/darkest moments, a living pizza that tries to kill the main characters. Maybe a little scary to a kid, but still pretty goofy, really. Then, compare it to the Zim episode Bestest Friend, where a kid gets his fucking eyes ripped out of his skull and replaced by cybernetic ones. Sure, it's in shadow, but they still showed it. And I'd bring up Dark Harvest for this topic too, but being honest, while that episode is really good, for me at least, other episodes are darker or just have darker moments, whether implied or shown. And I mean, as an adult, none of these dark parts even really do anything for me other than make me laugh now. I watch and play more fucked up stuff all the time. Watch Evil Dead Rise! Getting back to the episode, Gur sure does go crazy. That's all I got left for this one. Can we move on? This episode right here is what made the Tallest my favorite characters, especially Red. It was so cool finally getting to see these two assholes be actual real competent leaders for most of an episode, since they usually didn't have any major roles before this one. We had gotten glimpses of it before, like in Mega Doomer, but because they're both major players in this episode, we get to see a lot more of them. The Resisti are also a huge highlight for this one, most notably their Vortian leader, Lardnar. The joke where they have the lights off to try and look more intimidating is great too. This episode also shows off that Dib isn't the only one attempting to deal with the Urkin menace that's trying to take over the universe with their Operation Impending Doom too. Although Dib's not actually accomplishing much when he stops Zim, since, you know, Zim's mission is fake. But whatever, it's fine. The Resisti are not doing much of a better job than him too. Arguably worse, even. This episode also introduces another Vortian known only as Prisoner 777, and he's fun too for the little screen time he had in the series. He shows up a little bit more in the comics from what I remember. I bring this guy up to point out how good the show is at making even the most minor of characters super memorable. The dude showed up in one episode of the show in a few comics, and he's a fan favorite character. I also bring it up because besides Urkins and humans, Vortians are the most commonly brought up alien species in the series, if we count cancelled episodes in the comics, that is. I really wish we had gotten to know more about these guys, and we were so close to a bit more lore for them with the cancelled trial episode, but alas, it was just never meant to be. This one is also technically following up on another episode that introduced a pretty major character, but that episode is also the very next entry in this list, so it's a little weird to have to write around it. All I'll say for now is that it's really cool. This episode is also a lot more hectic than most other episodes, which is saying something. There's a lot going on, including multiple tiny little subplots, and it's impressive to me how well balanced it all is. It's also got one of the weirdest endings out of any episode easily. Ah yes, the introduction of everyone's favorite supporting character that only had one major episode appearance and really should have showed up in the comics but for some reason didn't. Tak gets to hold that title with Scooge. Oh man, that one hurt. This show really knew how to get me excited for new characters and lore, and then we never got to see that stuff again because Nickelodeon sucks. It's no surprise also that Tak steals the show in her debut episode. She fits so well into the cast that I sometimes forget that this is the only time she's ever fully appeared in an episode. The closest thing we get afterwards of her is her ship, which has an AI modeled after her own brain in it. That actually became an important plot point as the series continued. In fact, it's the thing I had to write around for the previous entry. It was also really cool to see that get followed up in Florpus too. Oh, and I gotta say, Olivia Dabo kills it as Tak. She brings this real manicness to the character that fits right in with the rest of the cast. And then she gets revealed to be an Urkin in disguise who has some serious beef with Zim. And you know, come to think of it, it's kind of fun how surprisingly similar both of them are. Like, Tak is significantly more competent, sure, but both her and Zim aren't official invaders. She, just like him, fled from a planet they were supposed to be stationed on, and there's a strong likelihood that Tak is also defective like Zim, too. I'm not going to get into what being defective means for Urkins because it's a bunch of lore shit and I'll be here forever. Just look it up on the wiki if you actually care. These comparisons are a lot of fun to make, even if they might not be intentional at all. This is also another episode where Zim and Dib have to team up, and it's probably the best episode in which that happens. It helps that it's not just Zim and Dib this time, too. Gaz and Gur also get fairly big roles to play. This episode really feels special, and it's arguably the biggest the scale has ever gotten on the show. Tak is a real threat for all of our mains, and it's so fun to see them all work together despite their mutual hatred for one another. You could tell the series was really starting to ramp up around this time too, and was going to do some more episodes that had even higher stakes, and that it was going to take us to new planets. And again, the show got cancelled before those plans could be followed up on. But hey, this is still a hell of a high note, and it's not even close to being the show's last. Watch my fucking Tak video. Yeah, it's not a proper top 10 list without honorable mentions, right? Let's get these out of the way real quick. Attack of the Saucer Morons, an earlier episode in the show's run that's just really funny. Also has one of the most hilarious visuals in the show with that stupid floating pig. Bad Bad Rubber Piggy, another episode where pigs are an important plot point. This episode's kind of fucked up actually, and Dib nearly dies in it in a surprisingly graphic and realistic way that's pretty off-putting. And also really funny. Gaz, Taster of Pork, another Gaz-centric episode, in fact her biggest, and just like the last, really fun. Although I like her role in Game Slave 2 a bit more. And finally, the holiday episodes. I couldn't just pick one or the other here. Both Halloween Spectacular of Spooky Doom and The Most Horrible Xmas Ever are pretty equal to me in my brain. They're both extremely fun 30-minute specials for their respective holidays, and I love rewatching them around the time they're relevant whenever I can remember to. Now that that's out of the way, let's get to our grand finale. I bet a lot of you are surprised that it wasn't Tak that took this spot. I don't know what to tell you, this one just ticks all the right boxes for me. It's a big 30-minute episode, it has a really memorable new character, and it's one of the few episodes not set on Earth for almost its entire runtime. Foodcordia is such a weird and fun planet, and it's one of the only major times we really get to see just what the Urkin Empire has been doing to these conquered planets. Bringing Zim back here is also a really exciting callback to the first episode, since it's where he was initially banished to before the events of the series after ruining Operation Impending Doom 1. The later episodes of Zim really liked reminding the viewer of prior canon, and it helped the universe of Invader Zim stay exciting as a kid, knowing that the past events in the show actually did matter in some way. I mean, Zim still would have probably been a great show whether they gave a shit about continuity or not, but this kind of stuff always showed to me that the crew members for the show cared about this kind of stuff just as much as I and other fans did at the time. Sadly, no amount of anyone on the crew caring could stop the show's fate of it being ended well before its time. And I know, I brought it up a bunch, but for one last time, seriously, fuck Nickelodeon for canceling this show. There's never even actually been a really clear reason for why Zim was cancelled. The most likely reason is low ratings, which was a problem caused mostly due to the show getting put at different time slots all the time. A tactic often done by networks to get rid of shows they don't want on their network anymore so they can have the low ratings excuse. And even then, the claims of it performing poorly in ratings is questionable. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. Better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all, I suppose. And eventually Zim did get to continue in some form or fashion. Not the exact way I would have liked to see it continue, but I'm still happy that the comics and Florpus exist. Anyway, that was a tangent, sorry. Let's talk about Sizzlor, the Fry Lord. This guy right here is probably my favorite one-time Zim character. On his own, he's funny. Paired with Zim, he's hilarious. From his introduction to taking his fast food managerial job way too seriously, I love every second this guy is on screen. And as funny as he is, he's also still fairly intimidating. You really believe this guy could crush Zim's skull like it's nothing. His design is also really cool and drastically different to any other Urkin we've ever seen in the series. Also, this 20-year joke he throws out always gets me to laugh.
20 years? But I haven't been gone that long.
There's a time warp thing involved. I don't know.
The action in this, near the end of the episode, has always been such an exciting sequence, and thankfully this kind of thing isn't special to just this episode. I haven't brought it up much, but this show gets so creative with its action, which is especially impressive for a series that's not even an action cartoon. It's always primarily been a dark comedy. But it's stuff like that that made the show stand out against its contemporaries. It was just impressive in so many different ways. And I gotta say, as much as I love the action, I think I love the background characters in this episode even more. Like this kid that's whole shtick is that he's just pointing at Zim and telling him he's gonna explode. Or Eric, the blob guy that helps Zim escape near the end of the episode. Or this other random customer that Zim just decides to vent his frustrations to for no reason. What are Vort dogs, and do I want to know? I honestly don't know what it is specifically about this episode that puts it above the rest for me. A lot of what I brought up applies to so many other episodes of the show, not even counting the ones on this list. I just always have such a fun time rewatching this one that I don't know, I can't help but call it my favorite. And if you have any issue with any of my picks, That sucks. Seriously though, I know some of these choices probably don't align with what other people think are the best episodes of the series, but I can't help which episodes I gravitate to the most, you know? And I gotta tell you, this was genuinely a really difficult list to pick for because there's not a single episode of the series that I don't adore in some form or fashion. They all make me laugh at the very least, and for a show that's primarily comedy, that's a pretty good track record. Back when I first watched it and it horrifically altered my brain chemistry, to even now, Zim remains one of my favorite shows of all time. It holds a very special place in my heart not just because it inspired me in the various art forms I work in now as an adult, but also because it helped me develop my tastes in art in general. I like weird, cult classic niche shit that sometimes happens to be off-putting or cheesy to a lot of people for various reasons. Stuff that's often clearly made at least semi-self-indulgently, too. Weird shit and me just vibe at the same frequency, and a big part of why is because I grew up with strange stuff like Invader Zim. Does that make me quirky now? Can I call myself quirky? Is that allowed? No? Fair enough. I wonder if I'll ever see Johnny the Homicidal Maniac again.